Thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to convene our special meeting from Wednesday, the October 4th, 2023. Mr. Clerk, will you call roll?
Mayor Coop,
Here.
Vice Mayor Stone,
Here.
Councilmember Vinker,
Here.
Councilmember Lowing,
Here.
Councilmember Livcott Hames,
Here.
Councilmember Burt,
Here.
Councilmember Tanaka.
Here.
For the record, all present.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. We're going to go into our study session, which is after I'm sorry.
Ms. Mayor, I'm sorry, before we proceed, Councilmember Tanaka, for the record, are you invoking the just cause provision of AB 2449?
Yeah.
Okay, can you please disclose if there are any adults 18 and over in the room with you?
None.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Our study session is to receive a briefing from staff on proposed zoning code amendments to implement the city's housing element, scheduled to be heard by the Planning and Transportation Commission on October 11th, 2023, and tentatively scheduled to be heard by the City Council on November 13th, 2023. And now I'd like to hand it to Councilmember Vinker.
Thank you, Mayor Koo. I just need to make a statement before the item begins. The zoning code amendments, proposed amendments that will be presented tonight relate to a specific area in Palo Alto. And within that area, certain of the properties are owned by Stanford University. Because I do life science patent work for Stanford, current government regulations preclude me from participating in the discussion tonight on the basis of a conflict of interest. Thus, I will recuse myself from tonight's discussion. I note that were this the city of Berkeley or Davis or many other California cities that host state universities, and I did the same type of work for those schools, I would not need to recuse. So I will be exploring how to change this inequitable situation and put Palo Alto on the same footing as other college towns. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Vinker, and we'll hand it over to City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Councilmember Vinker and entire council. Do want to note that obviously this evening's meeting is a special meeting, very unusual for the City Council to get together on a Wednesday. And in fact, perhaps just to emphasize the point, this topic, and in fact, the use of the term study session for this evening may be a bit of a misnomer, in that our typical study sessions involve council members expressing their perspectives and reactions to materials that have been provided to them. This evening's session is very different in that City Council, as with the community, actually received the report only perhaps moments ago. The report itself has only been issued this afternoon after 4 p.m. So just to provide a little bit of background, I would like to share that the specific impetus for this evening session is the release of a staff report that has really been prepared for the Planning and Transportation Commission, as has been noted on the agenda. The PTC will hear the report and consider the zoning amendments related to the housing element next Wednesday. And the City Council is scheduled to hear this topic, tentatively scheduled to hear this topic next month in November. That said, given how with the process of developing the housing element and the zoning amendments has provided increased specificity such that for community members, the information provided has now become quite site specific, that staff believe that it would be appropriate to provide some method of providing higher visibility to the release of this report. And in consultation with the Housing Ad Hoc, we considered a number of options, but ultimately concluded that holding a study session for the full council would provide the appropriate level of visibility and awareness for the community for this information. So given that, I'd like to turn it over to our Planning and Development Services Director, John Lade, to walk through the material we have for you this evening.
Great, thank you, City Manager Shikata. Good evening, Mayor and City Council, and again, thank you for making yourselves available for this this meeting tonight. May we have the presentation? Thank you. Okay, so So as some further backdrop to what Mr. Shikata said in terms of why we're here tonight, the City Council, of course, is aware that you adopted the housing element in May this year. That was transmitted to the Housing and Community Development Department of the state. We received a comment letter back from the state in August, noting that while we made some progress in some of the areas that were previously identified, there were still some outstanding issues that required some analysis and work. And so staff and consultants have been working on that. And about that same time, before you, I think, maybe went on your council break, there was a housing ad hoc committee that was formed. So through staff's work, trying to update respond to HCD and meet with developers to understand, their status and interest in development in Palo Alto, and meeting with the ad hoc, it became clear through that process that there were a variety of factors that may lend itself to thinking about some of the programs in the housing element that was adopted, that we might want to expand upon some of those concepts. And it's in that sort of organic process of trying to figure out some solutions that are responsive to HCD that this idea of a housing focus area or concept area for portions of El Camino Real sort of began to get a little bit more focus and attention. And as we were about to release the Planning and Transportation Commission report, meeting with the housing ad hoc and again with the city manager, there was an interest to make sure that we had an opportunity to pre-brief the council before that PTC report got published, which it is now published online and available to the public, and you have all received copies of that. Next slide, please. So this can be a little confusing. So I wanted to just take a moment to recognize that there's sort of a two-pronged effort that we're proceeding on right now. One is the housing element itself. We know that we have revisions, and we are taking steps to do those now. We need to move diligently on that, but because we're already behind the state deadline for it, but we are proceeding on a path to bring that back to the Planning and Transportation Commission and City Council in the first quarter of next year. Parallel to that process is the implementation ordinance that is required of the adopted housing element to make sure that sites that we've identified as meeting our regional housing needs assessment are adequately zoned to accommodate the density that we've projected can be accomplished on those sites. Specifically, program 1.1 and 1.2 of the adopted housing element identifies very specific amendments that need to be made in order to allow those densities to go forward. So the and those housing element implementation requirements, that has a deadline, a firm deadline of January 31st, 2024. So as a local jurisdiction, we will definitely be found. We know that the state's already said they're not able to certify us, but our inability to meet the January 31st deadline, 2024, would put us in conflict with state law in terms of having our zoning code updated. So that is our goal, is to meet that standard and meet that timeline. The work that the Planning and Transportation Commission is doing next week, reviewing it, is related to the RENA and housing element implementation components solely, not the housing element document, which we need to update. And it's this housing focus area that we'll talk about today, which is part of that implementation component with the January 31st deadline. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'll spend a few moments talking about this housing focus area as it's being conceptually put together. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll show you a map at the next slide that illustrates the boundaries. But again, our goal here is to make sure that we're identifying housing opportunity sites in order to meet our RENA obligations. We're attempting to respond to HCD feedback in the comment letter. And we want to acknowledge that there's developer interest in developing some of the properties that are in this area. And we also want to acknowledge that while we have an adopted housing element, there is some legal uncertainty about pending applications that are asserting the builder's remedy in state law. For this housing focus area, there are a set of specific development standards that staff anticipates or envisions would apply throughout this area with some modifications. But generally, these are the consistent standards. There would be no density restriction. Mass and scale would be defined by floor area and setbacks and height and building volume requirements, but not density. There would be a floor area of 4.0, a height of up to 85 feet with upper level step backs above the 5th floor for the 6th and 7th floors, there would be a setback from El Camino. Parking is contemplated at 1 space per unit. Code today is 1 space per unit for, it's 1 space for a studio or 1 bedroom, and it's 2 spaces for 2 or more bedrooms. Open space is proposed at 100 square feet per unit, as opposed to the current code requirement of 150 square feet per unit. And this could be in any combination of private and common space. Each of these developments, if they choose to take advantage of these standards, would be required to provide 20% of the units as income restricted at 80% of the area median income level for the county. Each of these projects would be subject to the city's local process of design review and having to go through the architectural review board. The projects would either meet the objective standards that are existing in the code today as modified by this focus area, or could seek to modify those standards based on the context-based design standards that the City Council endorsed, I want to say maybe 2 years ago now, when we went through that objective standards process. That would be reviewed and approved by the Architecture Review Board. Each of these projects would be subject to the California Environmental Quality Act. And we would present these as an alternative to the state density bonus law. So you couldn't go higher than what these base standards include. I will note for one of the properties that is in this focus area that we do think that there's some necessary transitions in height and scale because of a proximity to R1 zone properties. And this is the 3400 El Camino Real site where Creekside Inn is located. And so for that, we would anticipate a lower height up to 75 feet, again, with the upper level step backs and adherence to the daylight plane, which requires no more than 35 feet within, no more than a 35-foot building height within 150 feet of the abutting R1 property. Now, I will note that there is a policy consideration that we do want to explore with the Planning and Transportation Commission and then ultimately with the City Council about allowing a possible increase in that transition zone so that for the first 75 feet, it would be from the first 75 feet from the R1 zone, that it would be 35 feet in height. And then for the next 75 feet, it might be 45 feet in height, so an increase of 10 feet. And the reason for that is to potentially allow for some greater transitions setbacks at the El Camino Real location, elevation. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's the boundary, and you can see, I'm sorry, it's not labeled on this particular map, but it's the long That's El Camino, that borders one boundary, and then Page Mill Road toward the left. And then on the opposite side to the right is Matadero Avenue. And you may recognize these sites. On the left is Palo Alto Square. To the right, as we're looking at the screen, is the McDonald's Fish Market site. And adjacent to that is Hotel Parmani. And then across Hanson is a site that is currently used, I believe, sorry about that, is currently used by Rivian for parking and has an entitled office development on it today. And then immediately adjacent to that is 3400 El Camino Real, which is the Creekside Inn. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, before you move on, this is fine, you can leave this slide. So I wanted to also note that, well, okay, so for maybe just to reiterate some of the reasons why I think in the course of the conversation that staff's been having with the housing ad hoc, there's a number of reasons that seem to benefit or warrant additional housing production or density at these locations. You can see them on the screen, but I'll summarize them as the proximity to the Caltrain station. And you can see a white line that sort of illustrates the half-mile radius from the Caltrain station toward the top. El Camino Real with its bus service. California Avenue Business District is off the map, but in close proximity with a variety of services, restaurants, and other amenities. There's the Palo Alto Square. There's two towers on Palo Alto Square. Again, when we think about the context, that extend up to about 140 feet in height. And except for the aforementioned R1 zone properties abutting the Creekside Inn site, there are not many other sensitive land uses that would be impacted by greater height or density. We note that while not the focus of this outlined area now, we believe in our conversations with leaseholders that there are some additional housing opportunities nearby this area. The Charities Housing Project was recently entitled and was approved at 60 feet in height and 2.7 FAR. That's 100% affordable housing. And then the City Council recently had a pre-screening application across the street as well. That was going about 55 feet in height, as I recall. Okay, next slide, please. While there's opportunities, there's also some concerns or considerations, challenges that we should be aware of as we think about a focus area in the site. One is we are relying on 3 of the parcels in this area as housing opportunity sites. They're the ones that are shaded on the map. They represent about 561 units of future housing production. We do have a housing element timeline that I mentioned before. So there is a need to move quickly on a path forward with respect to the focus area. As noted, there is some uncertainty related to state density bonus law and builder's remedy that are related to the projects that have been filed with the city. And then I wanted to also remind the council, because we haven't had this conversation in a while, but there is still Senate Bill 35, which says that if a jurisdiction fails to meet its market rate housing production, that the jurisdiction is subject to streamlined project approval. There are a number of requirements for that, but for us here in Palo Alto, what that means is any development, any housing development that met the provisions that had 15% inclusionary housing would be approved ministerially without design review. And for us to meet that, and it's evaluated every 4 years. And so by the end of 2026, the expectation is that we will have produced 1,311 units in order not to be subject to that provision. As of today, we have 82 net new units that we've produced in this housing element cycle. 81 of those are ADUs. Next slide, please. This is a rendering from the applicant who submitted the development at the McDonald's and Fish Market site. Claim Properties is the applicant. This is provided simply to give some context for what this looks like. I believe you all have maybe seen pictures of this. This is a two-story volume space adjacent to El Camino. And above and behind that, there's two levels. This is a concrete podium type structure. There is below grade parking and 5 stories of wood frame construction above that. We call this a 5/2 type of construction, and tends to be what we are seeing more from developers as a prototype that is of interest. Next slide, please. This next slide, also from the applicant and included in their packet, is another perspective of that project. You can see in the foreground the outline of the charities housing development that I spoke about that was recently approved. And to the left of the project site is the Hotel Parmani entitlement that was previously entitled but has since lapsed. And you can see the Palo Alto Square Towers in the background. Next slide, please. And then for additional context, this is the current plans that were submitted with the pre-application for the Creekside Inn elevation, again, from El Camino Real. Again, another, this looks like a 5/1, I believe, construction. Next slide, please. Okay. So recognizing that you're getting this now, and we're going to have the PTC conversation next week, I wanted to note that we're not required to do the focus area in order to get the housing element certified. But we do need to do something, and we are relying on these housing element sites. And so we need to think about if we're not going to do what's contemplated in the focus plan, housing focus plan, we do need to figure something else out for those 3 sites in particular, or actually the 2 Stanford-owned sites in particular. And or we may want to consider whether these are sites that we want to continue to have in our housing inventory if we're not prepared to move forward with something like this. I will note that the 20% inclusionary requirement exceeds our local requirement in terms of the percentage that we require, which is 15% for ownership housing, and in terms of the level of income restriction, which we typically restrict at 100% AMI and 120% AMI. So the fact that these are restricted at 80% AMI is a low income level. That is something that the council has articulated an interest in the past. I will also note that these are rental units, and it is particularly challenging for inclusionary housing to be incorporated into rental housing units because the return on investment is different than it is from ownership projects, where you can quickly sell the units and benefit from that transaction. Rental has a much longer timeline to recover a return on investment. Okay. So I would note we are still in the process, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, of looking for additional housing opportunity sites. But if we did not advance with the focus area, then we most certainly would also need to find more housing sites. Okay, the reasons why we might want to consider the focus area as provided here, provides a straightforward process, application review process, which we know developers are always interested in. There would be objective standards. It would go through the city's design review process and be subject to environmental review. And it would also at least reduce some of the legal uncertainty that is associated with some of the projects that have been filed, again, because of builder's remedy and some aspects of state density bonus law. Next slide, please. Okay, so the housing element has a program in 1.1 that says we're going to rezone all of the Stanford zone properties that are housing opportunity sites to achieve certain densities and in the housing element, which have already been understood and approved. I want to note this site in particular. So now we're moving away from the housing focus area on El Camino. And now this is just additional information to preview with the City Council to know what the Planning and Transportation Commission is going to be looking at next week. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So this particular site anticipates a combined development with the corner property at Pasteur and Sand Hill Road, joined potentially with the property at, I believe it's 1100 Welch Road. And if so redeveloped together, there would be about 425 units total. And it would go to 85 feet in height. Similar to some of the standards proposed for the El Camino focus area, it would be, those would apply here. Slightly less floor area at 3.5, extending up to 85 feet in height, but also having a daylight plane requirement to protect that view shed along San Antonio Road. And that would start from the setback, not from the property line. This, unlike the other properties on El Camino, would pay the in lieu fee for housing. And this is a policy conversation, of course, that the PTC and the council could weigh in on. I'll explain briefly staff's rationale for that is in conversations with Stanford representatives, this would be affiliate housing. And some of that housing would be already subsidized by Stanford at about the 80 to 100 or 120 AMI on an equivalency standard. So in some ways, it's already the type of housing that they want to provide is already affordable in some context. I'll also note, and you can see it on the picture on the right, there is a well-developed apartment building complex at that location, which doesn't need to be redeveloped. It could stay as is, but in order to facilitate greater housing unit production, creating incentives that would allow for the redevelopment of that site does have a cost to Stanford, and having the affordable housing fees paid reduces their overall construction costs, and it helps us because it puts money into our affordable housing fund, which is currently in the neighborhood of $4.5 million. And we have requests from Charities Housing and other institutions that are interested in more funds from the city. And so shoring up our local funds, including the one that may be at the Sobrato site that we have through the development agreement, there will be some interest for funds there too. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so those are site-specific development standards. The Planning and Transportation Commission had a study session last month where they considered other Program 1.1 and 1.2 housing element implementation standards. So I'm just going to briefly go over this because the Planning Commission has already had a lot of this discussion, but I want to just quickly make the City Council aware of that initial discussion. Next slide, please. So again, we have these mandatory obligations to change our zoning by January 31st, 2024 for these two programs. And I'm sorry, it looks like I've been misspeaking. The program is 1.2 when it's actually 1.1B. Next slide, please. So for the R1, and this is for faith-based sites, for the ROLM, GM, the research park, and that's specifically for the 3300 El Camino, I believe, and for the PF districts that are included in our housing inventory. Right now, their housing is either not allowed or conditionally allowed, and so the amendment is to make housing multifamily a permitted land use. We are upzoning the density and floor area for a variety of zones, modifying identified constraints toward housing that preclude us from achieving the densities, and that is the landscape standard principally, but additional standards for the ROLM area. And then there's other requirements that we need to do just to ensure compliance with state law. Next slide, please. So as noted, some of the density standards are going to change. For example, 20 units per acre may become 30 units per acre. It's not exactly clean across the board, so there's some variation. But these density increases have already been identified in the housing element, and we're just following through with that previously approved direction. Similarly, floor area is being adjusted in the multifamily zones and in the industrial areas to accommodate the densities that were anticipated. Next slide, please. And in the industrial part of town where we are foreseeing additional housing opportunities, again, you can see changes to density, floor area, height, and modifications to lot coverage and landscape standards, as well as a parking reduction. Again, these have been reviewed by the Planning and Transportation Commission already during the study session, and they will be able to formally recommend this, take action or make a recommendation next week. Next slide, please. In addition to the zoning code updates, we will need to update the city's land use element. The uses are already permitted, but we need to adjust for the higher densities that are being contemplated. So we'll be making some adjustments there. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm moving away from implementation with the January 31st deadline and then talking more about the housing element document itself and some of the revisions that we're going to be taking. Next slide, please. So as noted, we are making some adjustments to the housing element, and we are responding to correspondence that we've received from the public and have taken a closer look at our housing inventory sites. We have removed a number of properties from our housing inventory site because we agree that they are not likely or feasibly to be built with housing over the 8-year period. We've also added some additional sites that we think would be appropriate to include. But I do, and you can see here the target of 6,695 units. This includes the 10% surplus on top of the RENA number that the MTC had assigned to us. But as you can see on that last bullet, based on staff's work to date, we do find ourselves in a bit of a deficit with respect to identifying enough sites that produce the RENA numbers that we need to plan for in the housing element. We're presently off by about a couple hundred units, and we are continuing our analysis to see what options are available to us. Next slide, please. I don't expect you to be able to see this map, but it is provided for illustrative purposes right now. This gives you a state, a point in time perspective of what's coming off the list, what we are proposing to add, and we've identified a couple of sites in orange there that we're still looking at to make up the difference in numbers that I noted earlier. Next slide, please. Okay. So as we wrap this up, again, just to reiterate, recognizing that the city council just received this material just before the meeting, the expectation from staff at least is we're not expecting you to be able to dive deeply or ask questions or engage at a level that you might with any other item that's previously been transmitted to the council. Again, this is a beginning step of the process, and so to the extent that you have some additional feedback or observations, we would love to hear that. But again, our expectation isn't that you would have a lot to digest in this meeting. We will be going to the PTC next week, and it is our hope to return to the City Council in November, where the council would have an opportunity then to look at that recommendation and the amendments that I've gone over this evening. With a second reading, assuming the council takes action and adopts it, there would be a second reading in December, and the ordinance would be effective in January before the January 31st deadline. In parallel with that, we are pursuing amendments to the housing element, and we'll get that to the City Council in the first quarter. Next slide. I think that concludes it. Okay, thank you for your attention, and Mayor, back to you.
Thank you. And so again, this is a study session. Ask questions. I don't think we give any opinions. Thank you. Councilmember Lowy?
Yeah, I just want to speak on behalf of the Housing Ad Hoc, as will the Vice Mayor. Jonathan, that was really an excellent overlay of what we've all been working on for the last 6 to 9 months, quite intensely, I mean to say, and intently, right. So we all know our quota of 6086 from the state. 60% of those are supposed to be affordable, which is great. But getting 6,086 units is massive scale build up for our city. And so what you heard Jonathan talk about, and we talked about in the ad hoc, was, are there some project or some areas that we could scale to get, sort of a bit of a head start on that? And so that's what is substantially the effort that was done in the El Camino corridor discussion that he presented in very good detail. This part of identifying that as a possible area is not new. It's been over 2 years since the housing element working group started on this, and my esteemed partner in that is here tonight, Cheryl Klein, and there's a number of people from the housing element working group that are online. We talked about that extensively, and it didn't look like this area was going to be ready, and now we're getting indications that it is, which I think is a real bonus. And we already talked before about the other area for some density and some reasonable height, which is the San Antonio corridor. So now we can have 2 of those potentially in 2 different parts of the city, which has some advantages. And I don't want to repeat everything that Jonathan said, but particularly in the El Camino area, we're trying to, where we put in a lot of new housing units, we want to have neighborhoods with access to amenities. And that we've been saying time after time after time in San Antonio, we must plan for and do that. One of the advantages here is that there are already amenities. There's bus, there's train, there's California Avenue with food and hardware stores and like that. So there's some pluses there, but Jonathan also did a good job of pointing out, the downsides that we have to look at. As we know, the city does not do development. We also don't own much land, even if we wanted to do development. The state's not flooding us with funding to do development in any way, shape, or form at this point. So we need developers to develop. So hence this meeting tonight to just kind of chart the progress that staff and the ad hoc have been working on. And so we looked at trying to give early visibility to council on this, even though typically PTC would get it before we do, and also early visibility to the public. And that's, just basically open transparency is why we're choosing to do it tonight. So I think that was a real good overview. Vice Mayor?
Yes, Vice Mayor Stone.
Great. Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thanks to staff for all the work, and my colleague, Councilmember Lowing, for that good kind of explanation of a lot of the pros of this site. I think we all recognize that tonight's meeting is not typical in our process, but this RENA cycle is not typical. And the reason why the mayor created this ad hoc committee was for the need to be nimble and to be able to pivot when necessary in order to be able to effectuate this housing element and to be able to kind of respond in real time and to be able to assist staff and try to be an intermediary between staff and the council. And we thought it was the right decision to be able to bring this to the full council for this study session tonight. So that way the community gets to hear this early on, to be able to provide their feedback back to us, and for us to be able to hopefully digest in real time. I know not ideal, but as Director Late described, we are on a very tight timeline here. So we understand it's not ideal, but any opportunity that we can have to be able to have more public feedback and more council engagement on this really important topic, we thought was the right move. And I think we all recognize that the last decade has seen a really steady erosion of local control due to these state mandates. And so at the end of the day, we don't have a choice. We need to get housing built. As Councilmember Lowing said, we need over 6,000 units built over the next 8 years. And so we're going to have to make some very difficult and uncomfortable decisions now and in the near future. But this proposal is really allowing us to, I guess, control our future and choose where that increased development is going to go. This is an ideal location, not only for its proximity to public transportation services, but also, Director Lay, I think you described it very well, the context of this area. It fits in very well, and it's away from R1 zones. And this is really just allowing us to be able to effectuate our housing element and, more importantly, make housing happen in one of the most desirable areas in the city, to ensure it's actually being constructed and that this is not merely an academic exercise like past RENA cycles have been. For several years now, this council has made housing, and especially affordable housing, a top priority. And our opportunity here to be able to actually have true affordability with 20% at 80% AMI is a great opportunity. So excited and interested to hear what our colleagues think, what the community thinks, but that was at least my mindset. Thank you.
Well, I want to say thank you to both Councilmember Lowing as well as Vice Mayor Stone for all the work that you have done together with staff on bringing us this far. And with that, Councilmember Burt.
Yeah, thank you. So before wading into the policy aspects, I want to talk a little bit about the process. So first, I think a lot of good work has been done here. And when we first supported our initial application to the state on the housing plan, what was brought to us after 2 years, I guess, of an housing ad hoc committee and an housing community advisory committee was a set of proposals. And it came to the council right at a point in time where the council had that meeting to adopt the proposals. I expressed a lot of concern that there was an over-concentration of the opportunity sites in the San Antonio corridor. I advocated more along this area and others in the research park and in our 2 greater downtown areas as the proper distribution throughout the city, and ones that would really also do a better job of having the housing not only distributed geographically in the city, but in areas that have services, that have transit, that are appropriate for more housing. So I'm pleased that we've moved in this direction, but from a process standpoint, I'm really worried that the way this is being framed tonight and was Monday, that we're walking into a similar circumstance where we actually, when we set ad hoc committees, they're advisory to the council. And the only way in which in this process that advice is meaningful is through a more substantive discussion tonight. We won't really have that opportunity because when it comes back in November, because if we really make substantive changes, we won't make our deadline. And so that will be close to a fait accompli when it comes back. And so I agree with the Vice Mayor on that this evening we should be attempting to wade in as substantively as we can. And I don't think it's correct that we are not to offer opinions. We very much are to ask questions and offer opinions. We're not taking action as a collective body tonight, and that's a difference. We can think of it when we have individual major projects. We come to the council as a pre-screening, then it goes to the PTC and ARB. This is not inappropriate or unusual to do that. Certainly not of something of this magnitude to think that this meeting would be really to just increase public visibility, which is important. It is important for the council to weigh in as much as they can and give whatever feedback they have as it goes then to the PTC and then back to us. So I'll add that, I've got a couple of minutes. One of the things that we're facing is on the El Camino sites, we have not only these ones that are not really adjacent to kind of sensitive areas, either neighbors or environmentally sensitive areas. The creek side is an exception in my mind. That's a different circumstance. Environmentally, it's against a natural riparian corridor, which is the most valuable and important ecological geographic areas in our cities. And that's where the overwhelming majority of biodiversity exists in our communities. And it's really important to look at how we have proper setbacks there that have been in 2 successive comp plans and not yet adopted in the zoning code. Then second, on the Pasteur site, I am concerned about just now hearing that this is affiliate housing, meaning housing for Stanford employees and affiliates. That's first I've heard of it. And I want to make sure everybody understands that at first I need a clarification. Is that rental affiliate housing? Yes, it is. I see a director nodding. That means it's market rate housing that gets removed from availability to our community residents. All of the arguments that, including our strongest housing advocates, have talked about the importance of housing for people who work in Palo Alto. It will be by definition primarily for those who work outside of Palo Alto, with the exception of whether they might include Stanford hospitals as affiliate residency. It also gets removed from the property tax roll as a result. Market rate housing in Palo Alto that will be removed from the property tax roll, removed from that for our schools and for us as a city. That's a big deal. And so a question I have of the city attorney is, I've been interested for some time in whether we can, within zoning, require that what we upzone is for general public access to that housing and not be basically a company housing. And so can we legally set zoning requirements that housing, when we upzone for something like this, it has to be available generally for the public, not necessarily restricted to current Palo Alto residents, but broadly publicly available and not limited to one employer.
So I appreciate your comment that you've asked that question before, but I think I'm hearing it in this current form, maybe in a new way. So would like to do some more looking in depth, taking the question seriously, but just to note that in general, owner of a property has the right to decide who to lease to, who to rent to. So I will look at this, but I'm not confident that there's a regulatory option for the city to
Even if
achieve
we're
that.
basically doing the upzoning as a discretionary action, or maybe we put a different sort of zoning that is 2 layers and they have a base right, but if it's open to the public generally, they get a bonus, which would be what's being proposed here.
Right. And of course, in a development agreement or something of that nature, then additional agreements can be made voluntarily in a negotiation between the city as the regulatory authority and the owner.
I'll have additional questions and comments in the second round.
Yeah, I'm looking at this as multiple rounds. Yeah. Okay, I don't see any other lights. Councilmember Lithcott Hames.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I want to join the collective gratitude offered to the housing element, the housing element working group, some of whom are in the chambers, the housing ad hoc, which the Vice Mayor and Councilmember Lowing created earlier this year, and to staff for doing the tremendous amount of work that this report represents. I want to commend you for figuring out the 20% income restricted at 80% AMI. That is a big deal and should be underscored that is, very, very promising. My questions parallel to some extent what Councilmember Burt was asking. Want to acknowledge his work on trying to ensure that housing is evenly distributed across the city as opposed to putting a huge amount of it on San Antonio Road. I appreciate that, agree with that. So I find myself, it's funny, you come and you do a good thing with these proposed changes, and here I am saying, okay, but what about, why didn't we, there could be, right? Why are we also potentially thinking about changes like this, zoning changes on Cal Ave, University Ave, even the other side of El Camino, given that there are some proposals on what I think is the east side or the toward Alma side of El Camino. We've seen some projects come through. I'm curious as to why we made this a strip down one side of El Camino as opposed to both. I realize there is R1 on the other side in the Ventura neighborhood. There's a lot that's happening in that neighborhood. It feels to me like a lot of exciting things, frankly, are happening in this part of the city. So I'm just curious as to why it was limited to this particular strip. I think that is it for me for now. Thank you. It was a question for the director.
Great, thank you. So, I think the answer goes back a couple of years, really, when we started this process, and we engaged with the community effort for a housing element working group. And during that process, we identified, I want to say 8 or 9 focus areas for future housing where it would be placed in the city. And through that public engagement process, many meetings, we went to the Planning and Transportation Commission, who reviewed those strategies, and we came to the City Council, who endorsed those strategies as locations to place or focus housing. And that really was we stayed really true to that guidance from the outset. And that's not to say, we as a city couldn't explore other housing areas after, at any point. But to do so now with where we are on the housing element would be a significant departure and require a lot more analysis and time to consider housing in locations identified by yourself and Councilmember Burt.
Okay, thank you. Nothing more from me right now.
Councilmember Tanaka, I don't see a hand from you. Okay, so let's hear from the public and then we can come back. Then we can take that into consideration. And Mr. Clerk, when we finish with the first speaker, then we can close public comments.
Thank you. Our first speaker is Justine B.
Good evening, Mayor Ku, City Council members. My name is Justine Burt, and I'm speaking as a resident of downtown Palo Alto. I'm in support of raising the height limit to 85 feet to allow more housing along transit corridors. I think it's possible to do so without adding a lot of traffic, because I know that's a concern among people who are worried about additional housing, that there will be Carmageddon in Palo Alto. Palo Alto is transit rich, as you all know. It's very bike friendly. I live near downtown and most of my trips are on bike or electric bike cargo bike. There's so many options to move around without a car. So as we look to additional housing units, these 6,600 now, it looks like, there doesn't need to be one car per person. Think about the 10 options to get around without it being a $12,000 a year personal vehicle. AAA just came out and said in 2023, the average American, the first 5 years of owning a car, is spending $12,128. That's ridiculous. So here are the 10 ways people can get around without owning a personal car. Caltrain, which we're all excited about, electrified Caltrain coming next September. VTA has wonderful 22, 522, screaming up and down El Camino Real. 21 goes to Mountain View. Samtrans, the ECR, up through San Mateo County. 281 serves East Palo Alto. Dumbarton Express connects us with the East Bay. Then there's a wonderful transit app, which if you're concerned about a bus or a train, what time is it actually going to come? It gives you real-time information. So that's a good way to calibrate with when it's supposed to come versus when the extra time you might have before you need to run out and pick it up. I'm so proud to be in Palo Alto with the bike-friendly infrastructure here. I know there's a lot of wonderful staff members and volunteers who work to make Palo Alto really bike-friendly over the last few decades, so really appreciate that. But then when you need a car, you really need a car. So we've got Palo Alto Link, which just serves within Palo Alto, $3.50 a ride. Zipcar, if you need to borrow a car for a few hours, rental cars, Lyft and Uber. So there's so many options. None of those are personal vehicles. So we're getting to the point where not everybody needs to own personal vehicles. So as we're looking to add housing and increase density, I think the mass transit and the active mobility options allow us to harness this moment and create a shining example of how to do this. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments. Our next speaker is Robert C.
Good afternoon. Mayor Ku, council members, city staff. My name is Robert Chun. I'm a renter in College Terrace and a board member of Palo Alto Forward, although tonight I'm just speaking on behalf of myself. Thank you all for your hard work on the housing element. I'll get to staff's exciting proposal for El Camino in a minute, but before I do, I actually want to take us back to May, when we approved the most recent version of the housing element. At that May meeting, Councilmember Tanaka, who I know is on Zoom, pointed out, I think, a pretty troubling fact. Councilmember, you pointed out that the housing element concentrates new housing in, and especially lower income housing, in the southeastern industrial corner of our city, known as the GM ROLM area. It's a true fact, and I think for many of us in this room, it's an uncomfortable fact. Just to remind everyone of the data, our housing element proposes nearly 2,000 new units in that industrial area, and it intends that nearly 80% of the families who live in that new housing will be lower income. 80%. So the current housing element does risk creating two Palo Altos. One Palo Alto where lower income families live close to the noise and the pollution of our freeways and industrial areas. And another Palo Alto where higher income families live near the jobs and the stores and the schools and the transit of our downtown areas and our existing neighborhoods. And I was struck that last May, many of us, including all of the council, recognized this fact. And that's why I think last May, Councilmember Tanaka asked staff what I thought was a very simple and thoughtful question, which is, what can we do? What could we do to welcome these new families into the heart of Palo Alto rather than relegate them to the perimeter of our community? And from my perspective tonight, staff have given you an incredibly exciting opportunity to do exactly that. I live a 15-minute walk away from the El Camino site we're talking about, and it is a terrific location for new housing. It is close to transit and jobs and amenities. And this plan is also more fundamentally an opportunity to welcome those lower income families into the heart of Palo Alto, rather than just into the GM ROLM area. You know, a single Creek-size Inn size development in this area at a 20% inclusionary rate would create 76 units of affordable housing. That creates more affordable housing than Wilton Court in an amazing location and at no cost to the city. So I hope the council will seriously consider staff's thoughtful and ambitious plan. Doing so would send a message that families of all income levels are welcome in Palo Alto, not just in the GM ROLM area, not just on the sites in our site inventory, but throughout our entire community. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us tonight. Our next speaker is Stephen L.
Good evening. I'm Stephen Levy and a downtown resident for about 20 years. I'm very excited, John, and thanks to Ed and Greer, I believe, or thanks are due. The two areas that you proposed are very exciting. And here's my conundrum. It seems to me that you're acknowledging, and our past experience shows, that something like 75 to 85 feet, something like floor area ratios of 3 to 4, something like densities of 100 dwelling units an acre are what people are asking for. And you marvelously responded in these two areas. So my conundrum is, thinking about what we've learned and thinking about HCD, how does it make sense that the zoning and development standards proposed for the GM ROLM area are less? And how does it make even any sense that we're going to meet our goals with FARs going to 1.5, not 2, not 3, not 4? Okay? And densities going from 30 to 40 to 50. I don't get the math. So I'd like to build on what I've heard Councilmember Burt and Lowing say a number of times and propose that my area, which is downtown, should be another large opportunity site. I think CalAv, but I don't have a lot of experience there. I think downtown solves the distribution issue, but downtown should have the same FAR, density, zoning. It's close to services and shopping and jobs and also transit, but mainly things that people can walk to or bike to and reduce car use. So I think taking what we've learned, that FARs from 3 to 4, heights from 75 to 85, I think should be on all of the selected or adjacent opportunity sites. And with that, I think we can return local control and get off of the spigot of builders' remedies projects, which I don't favor if we have a compliant building element. So I think this is a great start, but I could see it in 2 or 3 more specific selected areas. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Our next speaker is Adam S.
Good evening. I'm Adam Schwartz. I am a resident here in Palo Alto for the last 8 years, as are my wife and my kids. Thank you very much for the public comment. I'm very concerned that my kids, who are 20 and 18 now, will not be able to live here. And when they start families, I'll be having to fly long distances in order to spend time with them. My mother is 80 and she wants to move to be near me, and we are struggling to figure out how to make that work. If I was living anywhere in the country other than coastal California, it would cost her half as much to do so. And I don't know whether I'm still going to be flying to take care of my 80-year-old mother as opposed to her moving, near me, the way that other members of family for generations in my family and my wife's family, the children have moved to be near the parents and vice versa as family needs arise. So in that light, I'm very, very happy to see the two proposals on the table tonight, the one on Camino and the one on Pastor. And I also am excited by the changes that are beginning to materialize in the zoning and the housing element about expanding density in other locations. But I really hope this council sees this as the bare minimum. We have a housing crisis throughout the region. We have a housing crisis here in Palo Alto at all income levels, poor, middle, working, rich. And we need to do a systematic solution. And it's not just a matter of meeting the state requirements, although I hope this council does take action to do that. It's just a basic human need for many, many families like mine to be able to continue to thrive in this community. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for joining us tonight. Our next speaker is Beatrice M.
Good evening, members of the City of Council. My name is Beatrice Morales. I'm a 16-year carpenter member working for Local 405. And I stand before you today to discuss an imperative aspect of our community's growth, the housing element. As we strive to address the pressing issue of housing, it's paramount that we also champion the rights of the standards of our labor force, the backbone of our city's prosperity. I urge you to incorporate robust labor standards into our housing policies. This includes ensuring a livable wage, providing essential healthcare, benefits, fostering apprenticeship programs, and prioritizing local hires. These measures not only fortify the well-being of our workers, but also create a stronger, more vibrant community. Let's look to the neighboring cities of Redwood City, Menlo Park, Foster City, Los Gatos, and Capitola, who have set commendable precedents in this regard. By aligning our labor standards with theirs, we not only create a parity in the job market, but also foster a culture of fair employment practices that will benefit us all. Together, let's build not only homes, but also a city that thrives on principles of equality and opportunity for all. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Our next speaker is Cheryl Kay.
Hi, good evening, Mayor Koo, City Council members. So I'm so excited by what I've heard tonight. I really like this housing focus area. Thank you so much, Councilmember Lowing and Stone, for pushing this along. I think this is a great step to getting the housing and giving developers what they'll need to have financially feasible projects here. I'm particularly excited about the 20% BMR inclusion. The organization that I work for, Alta Housing, we manage the BMR for the city, and we get a lot of calls for people looking for BMR units, and there are just not enough. There are like 230 BMR units in the city, and I think with this vision, it will create a lot more, and it's very exciting. So thank you. I hope this is the start of a lot more innovative thinking. So I also want to acknowledge all the work that Director Late has put into this and his staff. I know it's been a really hard lift over the past 2 years. So thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Our next speaker, NM, is no longer online, so I will move on to the next speaker, Scott O.
Hi, thank you. I'm a board member at Palo Alto Forward, speaking for myself tonight. I have been cautioning CARE recently about affirmatively furthering fair housing law. HCD has been pointed on this in their latest letter, and it's hard to see a path to compliance without reducing reliance on South Palo Alto's GM and RLM areas, committing to infrastructure improvements to address their isolation concerns south of San Antonio, and/or moving that area into our school district. The housing focus area reduces reliance on the GM/RLM area. So from an AFFH perspective, that's very helpful. Is the raw acreage enough? I just don't know. It's a big deal that the question changes from categorical to qualitative, but I just wouldn't guess off the top of my head if it will get us all the way there in the mind of the reviewer. It's difficult to prepare a comment without a packet, so my prepared comment was speaking generally to strategy. I was going to say that if the city is determined to make the minimal set of changes that reach legal compliance and certification, it should expect more drafts as it creeps towards compliance. That is what I was going to say this because that's what the May draft and the zoning changes presented to HCD, presented to PTC looked like to me. It's hard to know exactly where the line is. So if the city is afraid of stepping a little bit past it, you need to kind of expect extra seasons to pass as we inch towards it. Putting all that together, I'd suggest that especially since you need additional units for RENA, and especially since you're presiding in a building that's 122 feet tall, it maybe makes sense to kill 3 birds with 1 stone, and especially try to get those RENA shortfall units through focus areas outside of GM and ROLM. And these the development standards presented in this meeting are consistent with past development and seem like a good way to try to do that. Director Late suggested that would conflict with the strategies approved by the Housing Element Working Group, but I personally seem to recall that those strategies, the ones that were approved, did include locating housing in downtowns and along transit. It's been a long time, but my own recollection is that the ones that were not approved were housing in single-family zones and in open space, and most of the other strategies were approved. I actually see Hamilton's behind me on this. I'm curious if you'd back me up on that. But anyway, that's my comment. I would also maybe second Councilmember Burt's concerns about process. I think those are very loose, and it also does make it harder for the public to participate that the packet wasn't here. Like, we're all making hot takes here, but I really do appreciate the effort and the movement on this. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Our next speaker is Hamilton H.
Yeah, following up on Scott's comments, I don't remember us trying to restrict the development in any way downtown or on Calab. In fact, I thought we upzoned it. I know we've upzoned it. And on top of that, you get state bonuses. And on top of that, we're planning on putting a bunch of low income, very tall housing over the parking lots in both University and Calab. So I don't think it's true that we're not planning on doing any upzoning in those. Are there areas for more? I think it's worth taking a good look at, but I don't remember. I thought we were doing pretty good, but my memory's a little vague. Getting to my comments, I share the same concerns as Council Member Burt, and also support Lowing and Stone's comments. I support the El Camino housing focus area due to its great location next to Stanford Research Park, El Camino stores, and Cal Ave. I support 75 feet for all properties in the zone shown in the presentation, except for the creek side, since it's right next to single family homes and the creek, and I think should be lower. I don't know exactly what, maybe 65 feet. It's hard for me to tell. I would not like to see the buildings in this zone do above ground parking. During the housing element, Stanford presented that they own either 2 or 3 of those properties, that they wanted to do above ground parking to save money. And that would cost 2 floors of housing if they did that. And so I would like to, I think there's a little bit of give and take. Given we're doing this massive upzoning, I'd like to see them build that parking underground so we get an additional 2 floors of housing. And I mean, if it's going up to 7th floor, that means 7 floors of housing. So it would be significant. I don't think in exchange for the massive upzoning we're providing for Pasture Drive, Stanford should walk away with being able to convert it to a tax-free status and not contribute to the schools, et cetera. So that's my bigger concern. The idea was that was supposed to be for the hospital, because then people can walk to work. The hospital is also part of Palo Alto, so in that sense, they would be Palo Alto. Maybe they can restrict it to Stanford Hospital and Research Park if they're going to restrict it to Stanford employees, and that way at least they'd be Palo Alto residents. I noticed something in Jonathan's slides about rezone R1 to multifamily. Of course, that made me a little nervous. I don't remember if that's what we already agreed to, which is like the R2 or whatever, but hope somebody checks that out. So, and lastly, I'm disappointed to see GM and ROM are still at 60 feet. At least 65 gets you 15 feet on the first floor. So anyway, those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us tonight. Our next speaker is Michael Quinn.
Good evening. I would like to thank the council, the other speakers, and everyone else who has worked so hard to bring the process to this point. I'm going to zoom out and just make a few very general observations, and I hope sort of my bird's eye view on this is not too frustrating or too general. I remember not too long ago, I saw what I believe was a campaign email from a member of council who is presently aspiring to higher office. And in that email, they described themselves as, quote, old school. After I moved back to California in 2017, I worked in finance with a lot of older people, including two people who, one was born in 1913. She passed away, I believe, in 2018. A gentleman was born in 1924, and he lived until 2023. Sad that they're gone, but two remarkable lives. Both of them remember the interstate highway system being built. They both remember Palo Alto changing from a rural community to a suburban community. At least one of them in conversation described to me the Golden Gate Bridge being built and observing that happen. Golden Gate Bridge took 4 years. I'm a New Yorker. The Empire State Building was built in about 13 months. Another member of council had the temerity to describe this process as nimble, that we're moving at breakneck speed to meet some government obligation. I'm a skilled tradesman. We can build faster. We absolutely can, and we could, frankly, quite easily hit our number. It's just that the political will is not there. Now, to give some context to that, Mr. Lath spoke very eloquently about SB 35. I would direct the council's attention to SB 423, which will be signed by the governor and will make, among other things, the provisions of SB 35, I think, pretty much permanent. There was a rider inserted into SB 423, if I'm not mistaken, that will bring San Francisco to review next year. Not in 3 years, but next year. And at that point, it is very likely that San Francisco will lose discretionary review. I would encourage the council to do everything that they can to hold on to discretionary review in Palo Alto, as unlikely as it seems at this point, and just to take a broader view of what's possible, because we have built for prior generations in the past, and we will do so again. The only question at this point is whether or not there will be meaningful local involvement or discretionary review at a local level. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your comments. Our next speaker is Albert L.
Good evening, City Council. My name is Albert Lustre with the Carpenters Local 405. And I gotta say, it's great that the City of Palo Alto is making many changes to the housing element to meet our RENA numbers. But one of the things that I don't see in the housing element that many other cities have adopted is a language for the working force, which include a livable wage, healthcare, apprenticeship, and local hire. Some of the cities that have adopted the actual language has been Menlo Park, Foster City, Redwood City, Los Gatos being the first city in Santa Clara County, and the city of Capitola. It's great to have those languages to protect the workforce, and also to have to ensure that every single worker in our city has healthcare, and we promote apprenticeships for the future builders of America. We need to protect those people. We need to hire our local hire, so we don't keep pushing people away from our cities. People commuting for hours and hours, 2, 3 hours a day. So I encourage the city council to please look into encouragement for language as a neighborhood city of Romelo Park, Foster City, Redwood City, Los Gatos, and Capitola. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Our next speaker is John King, or John Kay.
Thank you. This is John King. I am a resident of Barron Park and also president of the Barron Park Association. So I'm coming with two hats tonight. One is as a resident, and I appreciate Councilman Burt's comments about the creek side, and I'll just focus on that because, you know, as a neighborhood, we're concerned about what is going to be developed there. And personally, you know, in favor of housing, additional housing, but scale and design is quite important. The type of, you know, 5/2 or 5/1. I've been to Seattle and seen a lot of those types of buildings, and they're just not real pleasant to look at. So I don't know what is possible to be done on the design side of that. But also that, you know, the creek side and the creek are, you know, significant natural environments that we're concerned will be preserved. And something of the scale that has been put forward by the developer is, you know, concerning from a resident standpoint. On the side of the Barron Park Association, we're just obviously concerned and I want to be a stakeholder in the conversation. And we've had excellent communications with Jonathan Late and his staff, and appreciate all of your strong efforts in, you know, in bringing this forward. And we hope to see some great solutions about the creek side. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us tonight. Mayor, that concludes public comments for this item.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. We'll bring it back to council. And I don't see any light, so I actually have a few questions. With regards to the 80% AMI of affordable housing, 20%. So is that going to be something that is going to be deed restricted in perpetuity?
For the life of the project.
For the life of the project. Then also in some of those areas, especially where Creekside Inn is, 3400 El Camino, the ingress egress into the neighborhood, that intersection, is that something that is going to be looked into to make sure that crossing is safe? And as well as, you know, along that El Camino stretch, will there be more zebra crossings, pedestrian crossings, and making sure that crossing back and forth is going to be safe?
Yeah, so for any development application that is filed, it will be reviewed by all the city departments, including the Office of Transportation, for impacts that are generated by the development for mitigation. During the environmental review process, we will also look for any vehicle mile travel impacts. And then as a local policy, we look at level of service impacts, even though it's not a CEQA impact. And we look for opportunities there to see if there's mitigations that could be required. Creekside has not submitted a formal application at this point, and so it's unclear to me yet what, if any, mitigations may be required for improvements as you've described.
Thank you. On the same line on transportation and circulation and mobility, for the San Antonio area, the on-ramp. So that's very tight over there. Is there going to be an effort in visiting with Caltrans or with whichever agency that oversees it in order to look at a better model?
So I am not fully up to speed on work in that area. I believe our Office of Transportation is working with Caltrans and other jurisdictions in that area to because there is going to be adjustments to the cloverleaf in that area. And we are a stakeholder and part of that discussion that is taking place. I just don't know the timing or what input we've additionally had. That is something I'm sure we can communicate back to the City Council with an update.
That would be very helpful, just simply because of the densification of the area. And, you know, with the JCC and the housing over there, so there should be a easier effort for people to use the street as well as keeping traffic low or circulating. Let's see. So you're proposing this change in density in the zoning, upzoning it, and can the developer still come in and use the state density bonus or change some of the aspects of what you've proposed?
The way the concept has been put together and presented to the Planning and Transportation Commission for the review next week, it would be an alternative to the state density bonus. So there would not be any additional height or a floor area that we would expect through that process. I will note, we do have some objective standards in our code, and our code also allows a developer to seek relief from those objective standards by going through the context design process. That would still be available to a developer if they wanted to pursue that. But I wouldn't expect any additional floor area or height in that regard.
Okay, so that's the proposal. Thank you. And I do align, I'm not going to repeat most of what Vice Mayor Stone and Councilmember Byrd as well as Lowing had said, because I do align myself with what they said. I do want to say that, you know, with regards to Pastora Drive, you know, for them to limit it to their affiliates, it would seem a little bit discriminating. So I think that is a question that that I look forward for your office, City Attorney, to come back with, especially even to PTC, for them to know what the answer might be and what is some of the remedies there, because hopefully it doesn't further discrimination. Lastly, I don't see any light, so I'll keep asking. Lastly, you know, I have heard the Carpenters Union come in and speak quite a few times. And, you know, if these other cities have adopted, the cities that they name, adopted some workforce, what do they call it, standards? Is that something that we should, I think that that's something that perhaps you should bring forward as well.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I have recorded the cities that Albert spoke about: Menlo Park, Foster City, Redwood City, Los Gatos, and Capitola. And so we will take a look at that. And if there's an opportunity, or, you know, happy to look at that and add provisions and present that to the PTC and to the City Council. I'm personally not aware of what those cities have included, so it'll be an opportunity to learn more and propose it here
Please do look into that. Thank you. Okay, finally, Vice Mayor Stone.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just follow-up question on the Pasture Drive. Councilmember Burt raised an interesting point about the property tax issue on Pasture Drive, and so I'm curious. So is that Pasture Drive property only exempt from city property taxes if it's reserved for Stanford affiliates, or is it exempt because it's simply owned by Stanford, and so who actually lives in that property is irrelevant for the purposes of property taxes?
Right. Thank you for the question. So in general, standard length lease buildings, so rental housing that's rented for the standard type of term, 1 year, et cetera, that is owned by a educational institution, including a private nonprofit educational institution, and used for their faculty, staff, and students is exempt from property tax. It's not dependent on whether the building is on the Stanford academic campus or in another city. And Stanford does have some multifamily housing, I believe in this city and in other peninsula cities that are exempt from property taxes. That is not the case for condos or ownership housing.
So if that rental housing is owned by Stanford but is rented out to non-Stanford affiliates, we would be able to collect property taxes?
Well, the taxes are collected by the county and then dispersed in part,
Sorry.
and we do get an increment of those. Yes, that's correct. And there is Stanford-owned multifamily housing in Palo Alto that falls into that category as well.
Right. Okay, that's helpful. And I think that needs to be a larger part of this conversation moving forward as we have these conversations with Stanford. Not being able to collect those taxes is concerning. But I also think as well, when we're thinking about, even if it is Stanford affiliate housing, meaning that's one less, for every person in that housing, that's one less person looking for housing here in Palo Alto, and the region reduces traffic impacts going through Palo Alto to get to Stanford to work or go to school there. More people to shop at Palo Alto businesses. So I think it's a conversation that is worth having and exploring further in that site. Otherwise, I have no issues with the actual kind of zoning and proposal for the type of density and height at that site, but would be curious continuing the conversation about negotiations for expanding that beyond Stanford affiliates.
Yeah, thank you, Vice Mayor. Not to heard your comments, heard the other comments as well. I just want to note for the council's awareness, in our housing element, the one that was adopted, we actually did identify this site as being suitable for affiliate housing. Understanding the comments and the concerns, and we'll take that. But I want to note that at least we did have that. We knew at the time that it was going to be affiliate housing.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Councilmember Burt.
Well, just following up on that last issue, I will say that when we reviewed these sites a year ago as part of our housing elements submittal, we were aware that certainly they were Stanford-owned land, and it was among the few areas that Stanford had been receptive to housing. I'm almost certain that there was no discussion at the council about it being limited to affiliates. That may have been known through committees, but that wasn't discussed at the council, I'm almost certain. And there was no policy discussion embracing that concept. On Monday, we talked about the updated letter that the city was submitting to the county over the community plan. And one of the key concerns that the city has expressed, and the city manager, I believe, even spoke before the County Planning Commission to this effect a week or so ago, is that we really have concerns over Stanford, instead of providing the housing on campus for their staff and faculty, the county is proposing to allow 30% of that basically on our city-owned lands in the research park and along here. And our argument there was, and I encouraged everybody to reread that letter and give us any input that they might have on it. Concern is that twofold, same as here, that it diminishes the availability of housing for people who work in this community, and which has been is our obligation under RENA, and it's been our intention to address that. It diminishes that, and it diminishes our tax base. So we have the obligation, our school district, to educate those students, and they don't necessarily receive any property tax despite being a basic aid district. So I really want to encourage you to reconsider that concern. Yes, it does diminish demand that those Stanford employees might otherwise have in our community, but that these other concerns, I believe, really outweigh that. And that's already our existing position. I did want to just clarify for the record, Ms. Klein had said we only have 230 BMR units. I think she meant inclusionary BMR units. We have over 2,500 BMR units in the city, but inclusionary are particularly good because those residents of different income levels are distributed in a normal fashion in one housing project, and socially, that's our most desirable approach. Unfortunately, from an economic standpoint, it is often the case that these developers would rather pay in lieu fees, whereas certainly on the El Camino projects here, they would be included on site. The pasture site, they would not. If it's affiliate housing, doesn't do us any good anyway, because that would be for lower income Stanford workers as opposed to community members. But if it's not affiliate, it does matter. I also want to point out a couple of the real advantages to the proposal that we have, in addition to those already stated, of where we're looking at this increased density along the west side of El Camino, for instance, and primarily there, I should say. So as Director Late stated, not only does it have the look and feel of not 7 stories, but 5 stories by design and the top 2 story setbacks. And I think that is really important. As we're looking at an El Camino corridor, we don't want a gross imbalance on those 2 sides of the corridor. And Councilmember Lithcott-Hames was asking, what about on the east side of El Camino corridor? And the answer really is, first, that we have been increasing density there, but that is adjacent to lower density housing, and we need to respect that. That's part of our longtime rules and social responsibility, to have transitions there, to not have a 7-story building over the top of single-family homes. But there are ways to increase the density there as well. And I did want to ask Director Late, because it is, I do share a concern, or, well, we're already achieving it, but what we're doing deliberately on the zoning. For instance, we had over a year ago a proposal that got pulled back. It was a claim at that time was a developer at the veterinary hospital on the east side, really opposite this. The zoning that we have for that location is what? And related to that, given the transition requirements of low density behind it, would there be any merit to looking at changing the zoning there and a couple other places right along El Camino, not to the level that we have on the west side, for the very reason stated, but above what is the underlying zoning today?
Yeah, I don't have that information right now, but that is something that we could certainly take a look at through this process.
Okay, thanks. And once again, just like on the issues on pasture and here, this being a study session, we're not going to vote on these things, but if colleagues have a general concurrence in at least exploring those things, I think staff would benefit from hearing that. And I have more comments and questions later. Thanks.
I don't see any lights, but I do have a question. We received an email from one of the residents in South Palo Alto, the Redwoods, and they were looking at if it's the Palo Alto Redwoods Homeowner Association, basically saying since you're making this zoning code change, that their complex is actually a commercial zone commercial, and if there's any way that they could have that changed to residential so that they can get the same protections. I I would think that since you're looking into these kind of zonings, that might be something that you look at also.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I'm familiar with the request and one that we've had before. I'd have to take a look and see how we've addressed that. But as a, I understand that it's commercially zoned and a residential use. I think we've identified a process by which a rezoning request could be made to the association, and I don't think there's been a follow-up application made for that.
Okay, but since we're going through this rezoning process for the housing element, would it be possible to add that in there too? I would like to see if you can explore that as well.
Thank you, Mayor. I wouldn't advise that at this moment, principally because it doesn't advance any of our housing element objectives. It doesn't result in any net new housing units, and it doesn't count toward RENA since it's existing units. It is a decidedly very different process procedurally. So I'm happy to speak with the association and again explain to them what we've already told them, which is the path for amending the zoning map and submitting an application to have that go through the public process.
Okay. Since I don't see any lights, I wanted to ask, the Palmer fix. What are the pros and cons for to bring back the Palmer fix, especially for all the rentals that are being built in the city? And is what you're proposing on your upzonings to the developers giving us more BMR units?
Okay. Are you referring to the focus area discussion tonight, or
just for new developments, whether it's focus area or not, but it's going to be housing development, right?
Yeah. So I guess I'll answer this in a couple of ways. One is one of the programs in the housing element would have us look at extending the inclusionary requirement to rentals. We have done this before, and we've reported to the city council that it was not feasible at that time based on our existing development standards. We ran into issues related to retail preservation and parking, and there may have been another area with respect to requiring affordable housing for rental, which, as I noted earlier, is a different economic analysis compared to condos. So the housing program that's in our housing element would have us take a look at that. And if we wanted to extend inclusionary units, inclusionary housing to rental units, we would also probably need to look at increased development incentives that may be required to support that. As part of the housing incentive program, we're also taking a look at that, but I don't know if that's going to necessarily lend itself to inclusionary units for apartments, but I'll need to follow up on that.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Burt.
Okay, as long as nobody else has any more in this round, I'll wade in again. So one thing that I also want to point out about the positive toward around this upzoning along the west side of El Camino in this area that we're looking at is the impact on property values. And it's often underappreciated how much those zoning changes and the increases to property values drives up the cost of housing units compared to what they would have if they had a lower property value. And zoning changes where we take existing residential zoning and increase the density immediately increases the property value, the cost of the land. It may be spread over more doors or units, but a lot of places that have done that increase have seen that basically the replacement housing is more expensive than the lower density housing was. Whereas when we do it in a commercial area, that it's less of an impact that way. And ideally, I would be preferring that what we do is reduce the allowed development for the commercial aspect option, either as an option or even if we were to look at some form of mixed use. But if someone wants to put in commercial, we can take these properties and downzone them commercially and significantly upzone them for housing. We will have increased the value of the land as a result of that. But it makes the housing more favorable by comparison to commercial development by doing that. And frankly, the city can rezone as long as it's not what would be defined as a taking. In this case, we're increasing land value. It's not, in my mind, any question. So that's one issue that I guess, Director Late, have we looked at changing the underlying zoning in addition to adding, or are we looking at eliminating the underlying commercial when we're looking at the upzoning for the housing in these areas?
Not for the specific item that we're exploring tonight and with the PTC next week. However, there also is a program in the housing element to look at the commercial densities and reduce those, again, for the incentive of having housing production on commercial lots.
Okay. I also just want to make sure everybody in the public understands, we use these terms and we say increasing the density, and density is not the building size. Density is the number of housing units per acre. And so we really need to conceive of density, floor area ratio, basically the building size that can be built, the height, so that's kind of part of that envelope, the parking, and all these things fit together as Director Late has on, I don't see the slide being numbered, but it's the slide that says El Camino Real Housing Focus Area Concept and lays out those things there. And so in that context, I want to explore, and don't expect us to decide anything, but we're looking at going to by right, a 4.0 floor area ratio. By comparison, the highest existing density we have is 2.0 FAR, I believe. Is that correct for 100% affordable projects? Is that right, Director Late?
Slightly higher, 2.4, is that what you said? Yeah, 2.4.
Oh, okay. I had in my mind 2.0. Okay, and 2.0 is what we have for the hotels, and we're talking about something almost double the current. What I'm interested in is having maybe two ways, a baseline that is a very significant increase, and then going above that under certain conditions. Now, one of the conditions that Director Late has already laid out is the 20% true affordable. That's a big deal. But we also have a reduction in parking, and we have the difference between, do we go from, our housing incentive plan is 1.5 FAR, we're talking about going to 4. We could go to 3.0 as a base, double the housing incentive plan, and then allow going to the 4.0 contingent on a very strong TDM program. And if we're going to allow a reduction in parking and we're going to allow an increase in the density, it seems that a cost-effective TDM program to reduce the parking demand and to reduce the car trips is something that would benefit the community. It would be a way for them, really the only incremental increase is that we would allow that addition. Now, alternately, I want to ask Director Late, could we simply impose that aggressive TDM program versus having that as a bonus incentive? So we give the 4.0 and everybody has to have this very aggressive TDM program, or they have to I'm sorry, I'm just going to frame it a little bit more, which is we could say, if we are going to have that reduction in parking, you've got to have a way that you actively reduce the demand for that parking through the TDM. And so you only get that parking reduction, for instance, you either only get the FAR increase or the parking reduction or some combination if you do these measures to reduce the demand.
Yeah, so my initial reaction to that is we have provisions in the municipal code that stipulate what is required for a TDM plan. So to the extent that the council wants to revisit that policy, we could do that and come up with the definition of what it means to be a robust TDM plan. So that would be the process.
But I'm thinking maybe 2 tiers of that. Our base, which is a good TDM program, and then a very aggressive one in exchange for these very aggressive bonuses.
Yeah. Again, I think that would be an amendment to my initial reaction to that is it would be an amendment to the municipal code on that section dealing with TDMs.
Okay, thanks. I'm over again, but we'll see what you want me to continue. Okay, let me, yeah. So one other thing I want to respond to is there have been some members of the public who have talked about mixed use, office and residential. And what we have under, for instance, SB 35 and SB 423, the successor legislation, is a circumstance where a project that meets certain housing standards can have job generation in that project that exceeds the housing that's being provided under that law, and have automatic entitlement to that, basically, even though the net impact is exacerbating the housing need rather than rectifying it or reducing it. And those who in our community are among the strongest housing advocates, for whatever reason, just continue to disregard the demand side of supply and demand. And by increasing demand and increasing supply at a rate less than you've increased the demand, you have hardly solved the problem. You haven't made it neutral, you've worsened the problem. And I hope that we will get to a point of sophistication in looking at addressing our problem objectively and not ideologically, that will cause folks to recognize that that is not a solution to the problem. Now, there may be circumstances that I would be receptive to where we allow, if we're replacing an existing commercial use, say office, at a lower density, would we want to allow the replacement project to have that same density, not an increase in it, and add housing? That's a different scenario from a circumstance where it nets out that we have worsened the problem. And that's more nuanced. I don't think we can address that tonight, but it is something that if we're going to look at, for instance, in some of the other zoned areas, or even this, we have the parcel in front of the Rivian site that has a certain entitled 0.4 FAR, I think, for the office, and then they want to do a housing on top of that. I don't have clarity in my own mind on policy positions on that, but I wanted to help frame that because part of what we're looking at is framing issues for the PTC, not recognizing that not all the things that we're putting on the table tonight are going to be able to be addressed and resolved when this comes back to us in November, and that's part of the dilemma. We may tonight come up with some good recommendations, but they can't be incorporated that rapidly. Director Lade, I don't know if you want to add any of your own perspective on that.
No, I think you've highlighted the challenge that we're facing.
Okay. So lastly, I want to challenge members of our Palo Alto Forward and some of our housing advocates in our community who have said that they don't want to see builder's remedy type projects in our community. At the same time, HCD has made clear in writing that they place great weight on comments on housing elements, not just ours, from housing advocates in the communities and surrounding communities. When HCD has said that, they don't say that they're independently verifying or scrutinizing the merits of those claims. They simply say they place value on it and weight, and we've seen that. What we're seeing in objections from HCD is in many ways echoes from our own housing advocates in our community. The basis for turning down our applications to date have been to a good degree because of that. I believe that what we've already done is extremely significant, and what we'll be doing in our next update will be so. And at what point in time, just like we as elected officials have to say, we can't individually each time have a motion on the table, an action that we take that perfectly reflects our individual preferences. It's a question of at what point in time have we come up with something that is in the net significantly positive and important to move forward. And I will be interested to see whether we have advocates of housing in the community who will recognize what we have done and say, they might as individuals prefer X and Y or X plus 1, but that we have done very transformative progress in this community in terms of what we're upzoning for and intending to do in the coming years in housing, and that they will support that even if each of them have even individual differences. Same thing for us. I mean, we face that where we have legal obligations to the state. We have obligations to our community. We try to reconcile those. We try to come up with best designs and alternatives. And in the end, they're not only not perfect, each of us has a different definition of what perfect would be. So that's what we'll be facing. And I want to really see whether members of our community on each side of this issue will say, this isn't ideally what I would want, but this is the best we can reasonably come up with, and it is very significant. Thanks.
Councilmember Burt, thank you for that. I would agree with you on most of what you said. You know, when you mentioned about the commercial zones and it's up and downzoning them and upzoning it for residential, I think in some ways there is some good out of that because it is in a commercial zone, not close to homes, single family, and there's no displacement. Oftentimes, displacements of residents, oftentimes I'm reminded of President Hotel and that entire 70 plus families who were displaced. So at least there isn't that. In some cities, it's actual gentrification, you know, so at least we're not doing that here. With regards to, you know, creating that baseline and then going higher, you know, I think that, you know, we should really look at the TDM plan as something that we have incorporated every time somebody comes in with a development. But I am really concerned because with HCD and with the Build Baby Build folks, a lot of times they're not considering the community amenities that people need in a community. And so we have a family community, and I think that, you know, we're missing out on a lot of the amenities that our youth might want to see, or even families would want to see. I know there's a lot to do with, let's hold a food truck event out in the open, watch a outdoor movie, and sit on the ground. But there are some things to having a bowling alley, which we once upon a time had, and that's gone for housing. We once upon a time had a lot more other things, like we had Olive Garden, a very treasured restaurant, and actually well priced. That's gone for housing. And you know, fish market is going away, and that's also very dear to a lot of people in the community. McDonald's, our one and only, is going away too. So I really think that, you know, we have to think in perspective of what is it that is going to balance out our community, where people can also enjoy the amenities that we have. We managed to get some land at the cannery site for parks. And now parkland is gonna be at a deficit again. You know, so I really think that we need to kind of think about this in a better way than just plop housing and more housing, when we also see records that show that there is people that are leaving. There is a population decline. As for, you know, I'll save that for another time. But yes, I did want to get out community assets, which are amenities for our residents to enjoy, instead of having to drive away from the city of Palo Alto in order to enjoy those elsewhere. All right. I don't see any more lights, so I concur with a lot of things that Councilmember Byrd has said, and Vice Mayor Stone, as well as Councilmember Lowing.
And may I ask that you clarify which those things are, so that, because we're not voting and this is guidance to the PTC, they probably would benefit from you being a little more clear on what you're concurring on.
Well, I'm concurring with your comments about Pasteur Drive, where I think I also asked, you know, for it to be more clear, and if there are other ways to look at, what was your exact words? Look at if we could be more inclusive of people who are looking for affordable housing, and for people from Palo Alto, not only from their affiliates. There was also looking at Creekside Inn's location, 3400 El Camino, where we do have the creek, and that is there's a lot of biodiversity there, and so we want to make sure that it is protected, and then also the transitions so that it doesn't impact the single families behind there. What's that?
Let's see. One also is this concept of whether we should explore inducing or incentivizing a very strong TDM if we're going to reduce the parking or go all the way up to 4.0 FAR.
I concur with that, and I want to ask bicycle parking as well.
Yeah, and that would be part of a TDM program. And that's really, I think that's probably already part of the baseline TDM program that Director Late referred to.
Councilmember Lithcott-Hames.
Yes, thank you, Thank you, Madam Mayor. I wanted to indicate my support for the aggressive TDM. I really like the notion of increasing the FAR significantly, and maybe even adding that additional level for an aggressive TDM. As Justine Burt indicated in a public comment, Justine's head of PATMA, no relation to the council member to my left. But she was here clearly speaking up, as an individual, but she's responsible for PATMA. And I think the point is, we can't build out our community. We can't add significant new developments without taking into account the sustainable practices, the sustainable transportation practices that will need to go along with all of this so that we don't backslide on other goals, right? We want to be making it possible for people to commute in ways that are climate friendly. So I really like that creativity. And I also think it's really important for us to have that conversation with Stanford about not restricting residents of this pasture area to affiliates only. Thank you.
And I just want to make sure that, our feedback tonight should not restrain PTC from being creative and thinking of ways in order to, be it preserve, be it enhance, explore. So this is just part of our feedback, and I don't want them to be restrained by that. I hope the council agrees.
Yeah, and initial feedback at that, understanding that you just got this material.
All right. Do you have anything else to add, City Manager, Director Late, Council?
I would just welcome any overall feedback to our comments tonight. Things that, your sense, Director Lade, of what things could or could not be included within the next submission to the housing element, because I'm not presuming that all of them, these directives or these directions, even if PTC and the council supported them, could necessarily be included at this time, or just whether things seem on the mark or off the mark.
Well, thank you for that opportunity. And again, I want to thank council members for your feedback and engagement on the material that we presented to you, to the extent that you were able to review that and offer comments. I will say there are a lot of moving parts on this housing element right now. And we look at one thing and then we have to take a look at two other areas of the document. So in that regard, I'm going to probably give you a very unsatisfying answer and say, well, I'll need to look into it further. But I am encouraged by the comments that I've heard, and I haven't, there's some policy direction that I'll want to work with the city manager's office with and stakeholders, but the other comments strike me as things that we can take a look at and have further dialogue with the PTC and come back to the city council.
Well, thank you so much for all the work that you have been doing, as well as to the community. And we are adjourned. Thank you, Mr. Clerk, for being here tonight, and everybody else.